So the argument about design, creation, depends on our understanding of science. The more and more we know about nature, the more and more we can be confident in our decisions. And the case for purposeful design of life and nature reached its zenith before Darwin with the writings of this man, his name William Paley. He was an Anglican clergyman in the early 1800s and wrote a book in which he examined nature and made a strong case that it was indeed designed. His most famous passage was that if you stumbled across a watch when you were walking across a meadow, you'd immediately know that it was designed, because you would see that the parts were all fashioned for each other and for the purpose of keeping time. And this was a very popular, very influential and persuasive book for probably 50 years. And historians say that Charles Darwin read it when he was a college student, like almost all college students of his day, and was very impressed by it. But William Paley's argument was not only for design in nature, not only that life and the world show features of design, but it was also that the designer was a beneficent, omnipotent, good God. And later on, in 1859, when Charles Darwin published his famous book on the origin of species, proposing that, in fact, life developed by random variations plus natural selection, he took issue with not only with the, he did not only offer an idea about how life might develop, but he argued against Paley's argument that, in fact, nature reflects a good God. Because if nature contains things like malarial parasites and snakes and lions that eat you, then maybe this designer isn't such a good person. And Darwin made this explicit in a letter that he wrote to an American biologist, a friend of his named Asa Gray, about a year after his book first came out. And in the letter, there's a passage he writes that, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichneumonidae, which are wasps, with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, which their grub do, or that a cat should play with mice. Not believing this, I see no necessity in the belief that the eye was expressly designed." So Paley's argument was for both design and benevolence. And so Darwin saying, well, I don't see the benevolence, therefore there is no design. So the modern, now let's fast forward another 150 years. The modern argument for design is distinguished from Paley's. He got a lot of things correct. If you went across a meadow, you certainly, upon stepping on a watch, would conclude that it was designed, especially exactly for the reasons that he said. But the modern design argument separates those two different questions. Does nature show signs of design, and what is the nature of this designer? The first one is a scientific question. We can look and see what nature does. We know how to detect design. The second question is a philosophical, theological question. So in my talk, I'm going to stick to the question of signs of design. The nice thing about this approach is that, in my view, it insulates the argument for design against objections like Darwin raised. Maybe the designer is evil. Maybe the designer is, not all that competent. But was there a designer? And I think philosophy and theology, of which I am utterly ignorant, or maybe not utterly, but pretty close, can address those second questions. And so the modern design argument follows the same path that Isaac Newton followed when he proposed his theory of gravity in the 1600s. At that time, scientists thought that two bodies couldn't attract unless they hit, or couldn't interact unless they hit each other. They thought that bodies attracting through space was some kind of spooky idea, reminiscent of ancient ideas of angels moving planets around. And when they asked Isaac Newton, well, okay, you've got this theory and it predicts a lot of things and it works, but what is the mechanism of gravity? How does it work? And he famously said, hypothesis non fingo. As you all know, since you're here at this Institute of Catholic Culture, that means I offer no hypothesis. I'll leave that for the future. Let somebody else worry about that. Well, I'm going to do the same thing with the question about the identity of the designer and the nature of the designer. I'll let Deacon address those questions and other folks. Of course, we clearly realize that a scientific theory of design could have, theological, philosophical implications, but that's not unusual. Lots of scientific theories that address basic questions have such implications. And just before I start on the first part of my talk, let me say that one such theory is the Big Bang theory. You might forget, but before the Big Bang theory was proposed in the middle 20th century, most physicists thought that the universe was eternal and unchanging. But then the motions of galaxies away from the Earth and away from each other were noticed, and this gave rise to the idea that maybe in the past they were closer, and maybe in the distant past they were all together, and maybe that's when time began. And this, sounded suspiciously like a creation event. And a lot of people, saw that it had philosophical implications, and a lot of them didn't like it, including a lot of scientists, a lot of physicists. For example, in 25 years ago, in 1989, a man named John Maddox, who was the editor of the journal Nature, which is the most prominent science journal in the world, wrote a peculiar editorial entitled "Down with the Big Bang." And he wrote in it, he said, apart from being philosophically unacceptable, the Big Bang is an oversimple view of how the universe began and is unlikely to survive the decade ahead, he said 25 years ago. Creationists seeking support for their opinions have ample justification in the doctrine of the Big Bang. So, scientific theories can have philosophical, even theological implications, but that does not make the theory itself non-scientific. The Big Bang theory is a completely scientific theory, might have implications for other intellectual realms, but that doesn't make it unscientific. And I'm claiming the same thing for a theory of intelligent design, as I'll explain throughout the talk. Okay, so the talk concerns, what is the structure of the modern intelligent design argument? And the structure I'm going to present tonight is a lot like the one I wrote about in an op-ed piece about 10 years or so ago for the New York Times called Design for Living. It wasn't really a front page story. Should have been, I guess, but with computers you can do wonderful things these days. There was an evolution teaching controversy in the state of Kansas, and the Times wanted somebody to explain what intelligent design was for their readers. And so if you can explain your ideas in an op-ed piece, they're really not all that hard to understand. And the argument is going to have five different points. I'll run through them, and then we'll go through each one by one. The first point of my argument is that design is not some mystical conclusion. You don't have to close your eyes and raise your hands in order to see design. Rather, it's deduced from the physical structure of the system. The second point is that looking at that physical structure, everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. And when I say everyone, I mean even those folks who are most adamantly opposed to the reality of design. Even they say that, boy, it sure looks that way. And people like that generally say that, well, it looks designed, but we have another explanation other than actual design. And the leading candidate is the Darwinian mechanism of evolution. And so the third point of my talk will be to show you that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. That is, there are physical reasons to think that it cannot do what its advocates claim for it. But you might say, you know, every time we look at a science program on television or read a magazine or read a science magazine on life on Earth, we're told that science has already shown that Darwinian processes can explain all of life. You know, that's old news. So my next point is that those grand Darwinian claims rest on undisciplined imagination, okay, to be polite. And the last point then is a summary point. It's this, that the bottom line is in the year 2015, we have strong positive evidence for design, but little evidence to support Darwinian claims. So let's start with that first point, that design is not mystical. It's deduced from the physical arrangement of a physical structure of a system. Before we do that, though, let's ask ourselves, what do we mean by intelligent design? What the heck is this? Well, if you look up the word design in a dictionary, you'll see a number of different definitions, but the pertinent one is the following: that design is the purposeful or inventive arrangement of parts or details. And that means that we infer design, we conclude design has happened whenever we see parts that appear to have been arranged to accomplish a function. Well, that's a bunch of words, and oftentimes it's easier to see a concept when you look at an example. So let's look at such a thing on the next slide here. You know, I don't know if everybody in the room can see it, so let's go through. This is a Far Side cartoon, and we've got a troop of jungle explorers here, and the lead explorer has been strung up and skewered. And this fellow here turns to this guy here and says, "That's why I never walk in front." Words to live by, let me assure you. Now, everybody in this room looks at this cartoon and you immediately realize this was designed. This was not an accident. His death was intended. As a matter of fact, the humor of the cartoon depends upon you recognizing the design. It wouldn't be all that funny if you just fell over a cliff or something. But how do you do that? How do you know that this was designed? Is it a religious conclusion? Unless you have a strange religion, I guess. No, you know it's designed because you see a number of different parts that have been arranged to accomplish a function. You see the purposeful arrangement of parts. So this is really not all that difficult. If you can illustrate your main point with a Far Side cartoon, this is not quantum physics here. Now there's one other point that we have to keep in mind so we don't get confused about recognizing design. And that is that the strength of the design inference is quantitative. And by that I mean that the more and more parts you have, and the more and more precisely they are arranged to accomplish the function, then the more and more and more confident you can be in the conclusion of design. And let's look let's try to illustrate that. First of all, suppose you and a friend went out for a walk, and you were walking along and you saw these mountains ahead of you, the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. And he turned to you and asked you, where do you think those mountains came from? And you would say, well, I never did take that geology course. Plate tectonics or volcanic activity, and most people would be satisfied with that. But suppose you and your friend kept on walking and you were really avid hikers, and you walked by this mountain called Old Man of the Mountain in New Hampshire. And this is a landmark in New Hampshire, and this was actually unstable and was looking like it would fall down. These people up here are state workers trying to stabilize it. And of course they're state workers, so it fell down. Oh, sorry. That was a joke. And you might say in response to your friend's question, hey, look at this. This kind of looks like a chin here, and this is a little mouth, and maybe a nose here, and a forehead. Do you think some Paleolithic tribe, might have put? Say, no, that's silly. This is just a coincidence. If you look at this mountain from the other side, it doesn't look like much of a much. It's interesting, but it's just a coincidence. But you and your friend kept on walking, and you came by this mountain. And he asked the same question. How do you think these got there? Now you would never think to say plate tectonics or volcanic activity. You can see by the purposeful arrangement of the rocks, the purpose being to portray the images of the presidents of the United States, that these are in fact the result of intelligent design. Other parts of the mountain might have different explanations, but certainly this part is easily seen as the result of intelligent design. Okay, so that was the first point that I was going to make, that design is not some mystical conclusion. It's deduced from the physical structure of a system. We deduce design every day. So let's move on to the second point. Everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. And again, when I see everyone, I mean everyone, including those who most strongly oppose real design. And I can't go through everyone, so to exemplify this point, I'll quote a man named Richard Dawkins, who you may have heard of. He's a retired professor of biology from Oxford University in England, and a very strong supporter of Darwin's theory of evolution, also a very strong public atheist who's been in the news over the past number of years. And in 1986, he wrote a very popular book of his called The Blind Watchmaker, which was a strong defense of Darwin's theory. Nonetheless, on the very first page of the very first chapter of his book, Richard Dawkins wrote that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. That's the very definition of biology, says Richard Dawkins. The study of things that appear to have been designed for a purpose. Why does he think they look like they were designed for a purpose? He doesn't think they were. He doesn't think they actually were designed for a purpose. So why does he think many things in biology even look like they were designed for a purpose? Is it maybe for some aesthetic reason? Maybe because flowers are so pretty, or baby lambs are so cute. But no, it's not for aesthetic reasons that Richard Dawkins thinks these things look designed. It's for engineering reasons. He goes on to write, "We may say that a living body or organ is well designed if it has attributes that an intelligent and knowledgeable engineer might have built into it in order to achieve some sensible purpose, such as flying, swimming, seeing. Any engineer can recognize an object that has been designed, even poorly designed, for a purpose, and he can usually work out what that purpose is just by looking at the structure of the object." So what is he saying? He's saying that we recognize design in the purposeful arrangement of parts, and that biology has this property suffused throughout it. Well, is this appearance of design, according to Richard Dawkins, is it kind of like seeing the old man in the mountain? Or is it like seeing faces in the clouds or something, something ephemeral and intriguing, but, just passing? Well, no. According to himself, the appearance of design in life is overpowering. He writes, "Natural selection is the blind watchmaker. blind because it does not see ahead, after all he's a Darwinist, does not plan consequences, has no purpose in view. Yet, the living results of natural selection overwhelmingly impress us with the appearance of design, as if by a master watchmaker, impress us with the illusion of design and planning. So again, this is no old man of the mountain. These are overpowering appearances of design, like seeing the watch in the meadow. Okay, so that was the point that everyone agrees that aspects of biology appear to be designed. Nonetheless, of course, Richard Dawkins does not think that biological systems really were designed. He thinks that Darwinian processes are capable of explaining them without actual design. So let's go to the next point then, and that is to show you that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. There are physical reasons to think that it cannot do what is claimed for it. And there's lots and lots of problems for Darwin's theory. But one of them, a prominent one of them, is one I wrote about in a book coming up on 20 years ago now. And it focuses on a problem that Darwin himself pointed out in his book, The Origin of Species. In The Origin of Species, Darwin wrote a section called Organs of Extreme Perfection and Complication, where he was talking about the vertebrate eye and other very sophisticated systems. And he wrote, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, adding, but I can find out no such case. Now, in this passage, Darwin was emphasizing that his was a gradual theory, that evolution had to proceed slowly, in tiny steps, over long periods of time, because he knew if life improved quickly, in big leaps, then it would look suspiciously as if something other than random mutations were involved. So let's take Darwin at his word and ask ourselves, well, what sorts of systems sure don't look like they could be produced by numerous successive slight modifications? Well, systems that fit that requirement are ones that I term irreducibly complex, or have the property of irreducible complexity. Now, irreducible complexity is a fancy phrase, and I made it up to make people think I was smart. Hasn't worked yet. But it stands for a simple idea. It just means that you've got some organ or machine or system that has a number of different parts. And all of the parts have to interact with each other to produce a function that couldn't have been produced by itself. And if you take away one of them, then the system breaks down. And again, that's a bunch of words, so let's look at an example of what I mean by that from our everyday life, not from biology yet. And one that fits the bill is shown here. And this is just a plain old ordinary mechanical mousetrap that you might get at a hardware store. And a mousetrap has a number of different parts. It's got a big wooden platform to which all the other parts are attached. It's got this tightly wound spring with an extended end here and another extended end that hooks over this other metal part, which is called the hammer, which actually squashes the mouse. And you have to push the hammer over to get it in position, and it has to be stabilized there, and that's the job of something called the holding bar. And the end of the holding bar has to be stabilized by inserting it into the catch. Now, the mousetrap needs all these parts to work. If it were missing the spring or the hammer or the catch, you would not have a trap that worked half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to. You would have a broken mousetrap. It would not work at all. So this is what I mean by irreducibly complex. Turns out that irreducibly complex systems are real hard to envision being produced by the gradual process that Darwin required for his evolutionary mechanism. I mean, if you wanted to produce something like a mousetrap by something like a Darwinian evolutionary process, how would you do that? where would you start? Maybe we would start with just the platform and hope to catch mice inefficiently. Maybe trip them as they ran over the platform. And then maybe you could improve it. Maybe you could add another piece, maybe the holding bar. And maybe then when they trip, they could impale themselves on the end of the holding bar. No, that's silly. It can't work like that, because with irreducibly complex systems, the function only appears when the system has essentially been put together. That's a big problem for Darwinian theory, because natural selection then has nothing to select until you finish the system. And if you finish the system, then you don't need it anymore in any event. Well, mousetraps are very interesting. I think about them a lot. But what we really want to know is, are there any irreducibly complex biological systems? Cellular systems, or now that science has shown that the real foundational level of life are cells and molecules, are there any such irreducibly complex biochemical systems? And the answer is, yeah, they're all over the place. You can't open up a biochemistry textbook without encountering such things. And my favorite visual example of irreducible complexity at the molecular level is something called the bacterial flagellum, which is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It's got a number of parts. This part over here acts as the propeller. It's kind of a whip-like propeller, and it's spun around and around and around. And as it spins around, it pushes against the water, and that pushes the bacterium forward. And the propeller is attached to the drive shaft by something called the hook region, which acts as a universal joint, allowing the transmission of rotation in this plane to the plane of the propeller. The drive shaft itself is attached to the motor, which uses a flow of acid from the outside of the cell to the inside to power its turning, kind of like water flowing over a dam can turn a turbine. The whole thing has to be kept in place, and a number of parts, protein parts of the apparatus act as stator material, just like clamps and screws will keep an outboard motor on a boat in our everyday world. Other parts of the structure act as bushing material, allowing the drive shaft to pass through the bacterial membrane and not leak. And there are many other parts that I can't talk about right now. And I know this looks complex, but let me assure you this is just a little cartoon image of this machine, and that it has to have many other parts and many other features that we don't have time to talk about in order to actually work. Now, I like to show people this picture of a flagellum, which is taken from a popular college biochemistry textbook, because most people, when they look at it, quickly realize that this is a machine. This is not like a machine. This is not analogous to a machine. This is a real molecular machine. And maybe our knowledge of where machines come from can aid us in trying to figure out where this thing may have come from too. Another thing I'd like to point out is that perhaps you can see that the flagellum, like a mousetrap, is irreducibly complex. Take away the propeller, take away the drive shaft, the universal joint, any of the parts of the structure, and you don't get a flagellum that spins half as fast as it used to, or a quarter as fast as it used to. You have a broken flagellum. Or, much more likely, you don't get a flagellum at all, because in addition to this, the cell has sophisticated feedback mechanisms to monitor the construction of this machine, and it will shut down construction to save energy if it senses that things are not going well. So like the mousetrap, the flagellum is irreducibly complex, and much like its evolutionary construction by numerous successive slight modifications randomly in a Darwinian sense is very difficult to envision. Well, is the flagellum some freak of nature? Is it something, whoa, that's there, but pretty much nothing else is like it? Well, no. It turns out that almost everything at the molecular level in the cell is like this. The big story of 20th century biology is the discovery that our lives are based on machines. Just kind of like anybody here ever watch a TV show called Star Trek? Oh, yeah, there are a few. And in one of the later incarnations, there was a race of beings called the Borg, you may remember. And the Borg were run by nanotechnology. They had these little machines in them. Well, believe it or not, in that sense, we are the Borg. We are run by little machines. Our physical bodies are run by tiny, very sophisticated machines. But no, this is not the only example. For example, here's a cover of the journal Cell, which is a professional biology journal from the late 1990s, a special issue on macromolecular machines. And if you turn the page and look at the table of contents, you see articles with titles such as "The Cell is a Collection of Protein Machines," "Polymerases in the Replisome," "Machines Within Machines," "Mechanical Devices of the Spliceosome," "Motors, Clocks, Springs, and Things." Let me go back to that cover. And if you look at it closely, on the lower left, you'll see something that looks a lot like William Paley's watch, which has been discovered in the cell. So that was the point, that there are structural obstacles to Darwinian evolution. There are physical reasons to thinking that, that the theory cannot explain what its proponents claim for it. So the next point is that those grand Darwinian claims, not little Darwinian claims, I want to emphasize that Darwinian process can explain some things, and I don't have time to talk about that tonight. But those grand Darwinian claims that it can account for the basis of life rest on undisciplined imagination. And there's a lot of people you could cite to support that point, but what I'm going to show you is one by a man named Franklin Harold, who is now an emeritus professor of microbiology from the Colorado State University. And in the early 2000s, he wrote a book called The Way of the Cell, which was published by Oxford University Press, a very prestigious academic publishing house. And in it, he talked about trying to explain the molecular basis of life. And at one point, he discussed the topic of intelligent design. And he had this to say about it. He said, "We should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity." And he cited my book. But we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations. Well, that's interesting. Well, Professor Harold makes 2 points here, and I'd like to dwell on them for a minute and take them kind of in reverse order. First of all, he says that there are no Darwinian accounts for the evolution of a biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations. Wishful speculations, in more colloquial language, those are called just so stories. I'm sure you've heard them, the stories, children's stories written by Rudyard Kipling over 100 years ago. Like what? How the tiger got its stripes, how the rhinoceros got its horn, how the bacterium got its flagellum. All those famous just so stories. It's funny, when you think about it, but if you think about it a little more, it's really astounding that a theory that has been so utterly fruitless at explaining the foundation of life is nonetheless adhered to by a majority of the biological community. And it makes you think that perhaps a new idea might be called for. The second point that Professor Harold made, or his first point, was that we should reject intelligent design on principle. On principle, we should reject it. What principle? What principle is that? You know, you look at that drawing of a flagellum I showed you a few slides ago. Design is something that jumps off the page at you. And yet apparently we are forbidden to entertain the idea of design based on principle. Well, what is that? Well, it turns out he doesn't say. He just writes what I showed here on the board or on the slide and then goes on to other topics. Nonetheless, I think I have a good idea what the principle is that he's thinking of, and it's shown on the next slide here. And it is this, that intelligent design seems to point strongly beyond nature. It seems to have philosophical, maybe even theological implications. And he thinks that science should stay far away from things that have such strong extra scientific implications. Well, I understand his point, but I disagree. When I was being trained as a scientist, we were always taught that science is supposed to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Let other people worry about philosophical or other implications. And I thought that was a good idea back then, and I continue to think so. Okay, so that was the topic, or the point that grand Darwinian claims rest on undisciplined imagination. So the bottom line is that right now, in the present, 2015, we have in hand strong evidence for design, but little evidence that Darwinian processes really work as they're touted to. And you might say to yourself, well, okay, we just saw Franklin Harold's stuff that we have no Darwinian explanations, but remind me again, what is this strong, positive evidence for design? And it is exactly what Richard Dawkins says that it is. It's that life overwhelmingly impresses us with the appearance of design, as if by a master watchmaker. That is how we recognize design in the purposeful arrangement of parts. That is the evidence for design. Whenever we see it in traps in the jungle, in Mount Rushmore, we always recognize design. We don't ask for further evidence. We say that is the evidence of design. Well, what kind of an argument is that? That you say that, well, whenever we see a purposeful arrangement of parts here, we've always concluded that it was the result of design. Now, unexpectedly, we found strong purposeful arrangements of parts in life itself. And so we are also justified there in concluding design has occurred. Well, the argument is colloquially can be kind of exemplified by the next slide. And what is that? It's a duck, yeah. Because if it looks like a duck, and if it walks like a duck, and if it quacks like a duck, then we are justified, intellectually justified, in concluding that that is a duck. Now, like I said, that's the colloquial version of the argument, but philosophers know that, in fact, that sort of reasoning is just one of the two major modes of reasoning that we use to draw conclusions all the time. And they've actually got a technical name for it. They call it an inductive argument. You see. That's what they call it. Okay, well, inductive argument, philosophers, are we talking philosophy or what? Well, it turns out if you look up the phrase inductive reasoning in, say, reference works, you'll find something like this. Inductive reasoning. When a person uses a number of established facts to draw a general conclusion, he uses inductive reasoning. This is the kind of logic normally used in the sciences. The argument for intelligent design is a scientific argument. It's not a philosophical argument, except to the extent that all arguments are philosophical. It depends on the empirical evidence, plus normal modes of reasoning, inductive reasoning, that science uses all the time. So the conclusion is that intelligent design is rationally justified. So let's switch over to the second point. that Darwin's theory of evolution by random mutation and natural selection, the dominant view, is utterly incompatible with a theory of purposeful intelligent design. And I'm focusing on this because many well-meaning Christian scientists who are Christian try to reconcile the two. They say that, well, this is not a problem for the Christian faith, that it's easily compatible. And I'm going to take the opposite view, that in fact it's utterly, utterly incompatible.